keep it informal and to make it back and forth. So I thought maybe we could start without that and maybe just have responses and questions if you have any. But if not, even when I am giving the talk, please interrupt me and ask a question or make an observation. I'm very pleased and honored to have these paintings on the wall. I've been making art in many mediums for many years, but I am quite new to making paintings like this and owning them, saying this. These are okay to share. So it's very new to me, but I will take you through my process and my history a little bit in this artist talk. One of the things that is interesting to me is what is the connection between these pictures and that are still and the film and video that is in motion, and the question of what is abstract and what is not abstract, because I lose track. And also, especially the relationship between the photograph and the works with the hand, drawing and painting. What makes them work and what makes them similar and what makes them different. My own experience of making images is much more dominated through the practice of photography or looking through a lens. And so when I make a composition, I am used to making it in an instant by recognizing something. I'm looking through a camera and I make a picture. I don't always know what I've made or whether it's good. And when I paint, I've been working mostly from photographs. And for the composition, the process of painting is the process of discovering what it was I saw, because I'm not conscious of what I saw when I made the picture. So I'm finding out of the photograph the composition of the painting. And then the distinction and the process is very interesting to me. Are there any questions or comments or areas of interest before we even start? That's asking a lot, perhaps. Can everyone see this screen down here from where you are?
Yes.
So I came to film, when I started making art, I did drawing and photography and painting and sculpture and printmaking, but film became the medium that was most engaging and that I excelled most in. But I have always had a practice of working in the other mediums, but early on I never really developed a body of work in painting or drawing that I considered something that I would present. For me, drawing was always the best way to think visually. So I would always return to drawing. It seems so fundamental to me. But often my drawing were ways of thinking about ideas for films that I was going to make, or perhaps to think about films that I had made. So you can see here, you know, elements of films that have not yet been made or that were already made, with the film reel and the circles, and you'll see many of the ideas coming forward already in the two-dimensional drawing. But my early work in film was very related to minimalism and ideas of the material of art, you know, art about art, you know, what is film, what is a photograph, what are the materials of the medium, you know, the emulsion, the sprocket holes, scratches on the surface, and ideas that were very current at the time in terms of minimalism, of discovering complexity and simplicity, trying to think about, you know, if you eliminate so much, more reveals itself. So this is another drawing, you know, thinking about a film that I had made, where the circles are all colors and light, but here it's marks with a pencil. Sometimes I would just play, you know, there's not, I'm just taking off, I'm just thinking visually, I'm just making pictures. Jump ahead 20 or 30 years, I really hadn't, I mean, I had an active practice in film, but, you know, we had kids and I had jobs, and but 20 or 30 years later, I began drawing again, and this time my children had grown enough that they began leaving home, and I began missing them, and so I started a series of drawings called Drawing My Family Closer, which is a pun. So these are our daughters. And there's Katy, sometimes working from photographs, sometimes just from life. And then when I would travel, I would do the same with friends. So these are friends that I would meet. These are some friends from Uruguay. And I was very interested in working between mediums. So what happens if you take a film and it becomes a photograph, or a photograph and it becomes a film, or a photograph and you make a drawing, or a video and you take one frame out of it and make a photograph out of it. And so I had some exhibitions. These were at my college where they had exhibitions for the faculty. And here, this on this side, this is 4 frames from a 16mm film that I printed as still photographs. Mm-hmm. These 3 are friends from Uruguay who I just took little snapshots of. And then the picture on the left is a frame from a video. And this is also a time when digital and video and photography were starting to become the sort of the same medium. So it was very interesting to me. And these, I was out with my friends in Uruguay, and they all realized they had these scars on their chins. And again, this is back in New York, I tried to continue this idea of juxtaposing one medium with another that was intertwined. So I had a drawing of a person that I did some video work with, and then I made this abstract video with these shapes, and then I made photographs from that video that we printed and displayed, and I put them together in an exhibition, and not really knowing why exactly, and I'm still not even clear. So it's the search to find out what the question is, not even necessarily what the answer to the question is. This is a still from a 16mm film where I was working with another artist who was performing, and I was interested in sort of improvisational performance in a space. Where you have a performance, but it doesn't tell a story. Before I came to Paris the other day, I called Bob Huot, whose work is here and who is responsible for us being in this gallery. And he said that he and his wife Carol, they say to each other that they're both abstract artists, but that she's basically a landscape artist and he's basically a figurative artist. And Bob said about Katy and myself that we are also both abstract artists, but it's switched, where Katy is a figurative artist and I'm more a landscape artist. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. It was very, very nice of him to say that before I came here. But in this film, one of my challenges, I noticed that whenever you put a figure in a landscape, the landscape becomes the background to the figure. And for me, a landscape is a very expressive thing. And I wondered, can you put a figure in a landscape and have the landscape be an equal part of the expression? Or does it become the background? So that was the challenge for me of this film. And it became a film very much about making marks. I'm going to show you a little clip of it. little taste of it. But this is my old neighborhood. So somehow I you know, the sense of home, and not, you know, that you can make from art from wherever you stand is also a consistent thing for me, I think. Now I have to go back, and then I have to quickly go through to get to where we were. In 2015, before we were here for the first time, Katy and I were invited to be artists in residence in China. Katy had gone to China many times and had friends there, and I was lucky enough to also be invited for this residency in Shanghai. And we were there for 3 weeks, and they gave us this very large studio, and all we were required to do was to go to the studio and make art. It was really wonderful. And Katy had one side, and I had the other. And I had been making these drawings like I just showed you, pencil on paper mostly, and working between drawing and photography and video. So that was what my idea was, to continue that work. But when we arrived, our hosts, it was the traditional Chinese painting department, and they said, well, our residents, we give you ink and paper because that's the medium of traditional Chinese painting, and we want you to use them, and we'll even give you some lessons. And it knocked my socks off. It was so amazing. I got very interested, and it was very important, the permission that I was given to just make it up, because I knew nothing about Chinese art. But I wanted to do the same thing that I had been doing, and I met a couple of Chinese artists, and I asked them if they would work with me one day and take me to some location that meant something to them each, and I would photograph them and I would make the work from that. So she took me to, Yin took me to this, it looks like a forest, but it was actually an empty lot where they were growing trees to plant somewhere else, and all around there was construction. They were making very big buildings, but it was like this little sanctuary. Bo took me to this very busy animal and plant market. And so from that experience, then the rest of the time I did drawings and ink paintings. Of them and of the environments it took me to. Part of our residency was to participate in the exhibition, mostly Chinese artists, but we were the residents, and so it was an honor to be part of this exhibition. But it wasn't really the work that I had made we didn't do the work that I made during the residency, and I wasn't really ready for that. So I did a similar thing where I showed, okay, this is Katy, who was already making these paintings. You did that with a brush though, right? No?
I'll just interrupt. This is made, the dark marks with my body, like just like this, same motion, and then with a brush, I went over it, made a kind of rhythm over it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So what I put in the show was the film, Susie's Ghost, the video of the film that I just showed a clip of, one of the drawings, and the photograph of the chins from the 3 film stills. But when I came back to New York, I continued what I had begun, and I kept working from the photographs and video that I had made in China. You know, these are plants and animals from the market, and often I would make a pencil drawing, and then from that an ink drawing. At some point, I realized that I could literally draw back into the video by using a technique that I had developed decades earlier in film and I was beginning to explore in the computer, that looks like the video that you were just looking at when you came in. But those shapes that you saw are actually ink on Chinese paper. Here, you can just pass these around. I'll take them back. But
How long you stay in China, in Shanghai? How long?
3 semaines.
You parles français?
Now they are, I don't remember how they go, but they're carefully arranged so that they fit together in a special way.
Okay.
And I will explain more about that later in the talk.
To Chinese paper?
Yes, this is shrimp paper, yes.
Wait.
But you mean when you started to experiment with Chinese painting, it was black and white only?
Yes.
The color came later?
Later,
Okay.
yeah.
Why?
Why? I had a graduate student. I teach film preservation, and one of my students was Chinese, and she had trained as an artist first, and she said, "Oh, you must work with color too."
Okay.
And here's, here.
Thanks to her.
She still gives me advice. That was Shuben.
But I mean, when you introduce the term of abstraction, how do you think it can relate to black and white or color works?
I sigh because I've given a lot of thought today. My first films were black and white, and when I started working in color, I felt very confused, and so I thought about it very abstractly, and then, so my first color films were just color. So I have a series of films I call Acts of Light, and one of them, there's no shape at all, it's just color, and the color changes continuously. And then color is actually a very, very interesting subject, intellectually. I've studied it a lot. It's not a dimension like height and width and depth or time. It's not a thing. So it is, and is it something in the world, or is it something in our brain? So colors, there's a lot of
I think
things.
so. Seeing your work, I think that color is a great subject.
Yes, and so colors become very important to me. And I don't know how to answer the question of, where is color abstract and where is it not? But I'll try to respond to that question as we make our way through. That's why I appreciate you asking now.
I remember what you showed 3 years ago when we met first time. You had a series of flowers which were pink colors,
Yes.
and I don't remember the exact number of.
Well, that was like
12
this.
or
Yeah,
9.
I'm actually going to show those
Yes, okay.
in the talk. So.
Okay.
Even before I did this with the ink, I was beginning in the computer to work with these, draw shapes and make videos that looked like this. That all these ideas came from work I had done in film 20 years before. This is still the work from China. So I made a couple of videos from the video that I shot with those 2 Chinese artists and the ink shapes that I showed in the gallery here. So I'm not going to show all of that, but this was my first show here in the gallery. And the video was back there on the window. And then sometimes I would take frames from that video and I would print them out as a photograph to see, if that worked. I kept making, not just from the China work, but when I traveled and other places, and I did a lot of traveling in those years. So when I went to Mexico, I took photographs and I used those to make more ink drawings. These are both from Mexico City at night. And then also in Spain, I had traveled to Spain. And that's when I began using color in them. And I began getting more control. And again, I was not trained. I was making this up. And I was getting better. And this was from last time I was here from Paris. And this is the,
That's it.
so Arnaud had an exhibition that I did not come to, but Katy came and she did a performance. It was called A Turtle. And maybe this was another one. No, I think it was that one. So he invited me to submit something to this exhibition, and I had been making these ink paintings and decided to see if I could make an animation from them. So these are some of the panels from the animation. And I did make a piece called August Garden, and I sent it to Arnaud, and he showed it. But I was very happy with the video and with the animation, but I was not so happy with the painting.
I remember that.
And I thought, you know, I should learn more about Chinese painting. This is stupid to be expecting myself to reinvent this medium that's 3,000 years old. And I discovered that the place that I bought my materials from, where I bought my paper and my brushes, offered lessons for Chinese painting online. And I started taking them. And I felt very, very funny doing this because, you know, my training as an artist, as a modern artist, as an abstract artist, it's all about invention and originality. And here I was taking lessons that was all about copying and following, you know, rules that are thousands of years old. And I would make, you know, I made this scroll following, you know, a great master. I even learned to mount it. And I began, you know, the very basics. These are called the Four Noble plants: the orchid, the bamboo, plum blossom, chrysanthemum, and they also represent different seasons. This is not the way I have been making art for 50 years prior to this. So I'm not telling anybody. I'm kind of a little self-conscious, but having a wonderful time. It was very permission-giving. And suddenly my studio was full of flowers and chickens and cats. And I was, you know, becoming very sensitive to, you know, great masters of Chinese art and having my favorites and trying to copy them and learning techniques like dotting the brush. You know, you can spend years mastering how to make a dot with your brush. And also I learned that there are, you know, different fundamental methods of Chinese painting. There's something called the elaborate style, where everything is planned out very carefully, and then you fill that in, and the other is more improvisational. So I was working in pandas. Who doesn't love pandas? But me, I don't like pandas. And birds. So I had a lesson in birds. So for me, it was very interesting to work between the very planned out kind of painting, where I use a slightly less absorbent paper, and the freer kind of freehand calligraphic use of the brush. But with birds, I'm copying, you know, great masters and following some lessons. But birds have a special place in my family because my grandfather and my father were both students of birds. They were both ornithologists. My grandfather being a pioneer of recording bird songs.
And your daughter sings.
Yes, and my daughter sings. And these are after some of my favorite Chinese artists. But this is actually a photograph that was published in a book by my grandfather's teacher, but my father took that picture in the 1930s when he was a young man. So I said, okay, this is the way back into now I have learned these Chinese painting techniques, but let me begin to apply them to what I was doing before, of inventing my own way and making things that were not copies of traditional forms, but working from photographs. So, these are from Western photographs of bird studies, as is this. And you can see how, it starts to look like Chinese painting, but it's not. And there are a lot of great differences, and I find that fascinating. This is from a Chinese painting, that's from a photograph. Around this time, we all went into COVID lockdown. We were stuck in our house. Fortunately, we had our studios at home, so it wasn't so bad. And I discovered that I could walk in my neighborhood, and it was safe, and it was a way of not going crazy. So I started making pictures from the neighborhood. First on ink, and then ink and watercolor. Often these, people's private yards, but even, the tire place.
So from photographies, or?
Yes, sometimes I would deliberately go out with a camera, but occasionally I'll just pull my phone out and take a picture. But usually when I walk, I'm trying to get exercise and I'm thinking, and when I take my camera out purposely to photograph, it's a very different mental state. It's much slower and more deliberate in some ways.
Would you say that Chinese painting changed your way to take pictures with photograph alcohol?
I haven't really thought about that, but that's a good question. Maybe you can answer it for me.
I think so.
Well, I certainly see differently, and here, this is an ink and watercolor on Chinese paper of, these weeds in a sidewalk in my neighborhood, and the use of the empty space there is very Chinese. That's very influenced by, what I learned about Chinese painting. But did I take that photograph thinking that? Not that I know of, but maybe I did.
That's your feeling that I want to question.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And in the debut of your presentation, you said something like you took photos to see what you have seen.
Well, when I photograph, generally when I walk out, I have no ideas. I'm not looking for something in particular. And I will be attracted to something, and I'll pay attention to that feeling that I have,
Yes.
and I'll take the picture.
And then you discover.
But I don't know why. I don't know what's there. So it's only later that first I look at the pictures and I say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why.
That's proper to the photography technique.
Yes.
I would like to know if your practice of Chinese painting can also respond to this question.
I wonder. And the answer is certainly yes.
I think so, certainly.
But I don't know how yet. It's wonderful. Thank you. At some point, Katy and other friends of ours who are artists said, you should try painting on canvas too. because watercolor on canvas, is quite interesting. So I tried it.
When I was a child at school, we had some film with crystal paper, and we painted our pictures that was processed by sort of an appareil to Judith, tu sais peut-être ça, tu sais quand on faisait à l'école, je sais pas si tu as connu ça, mais on travaillait le film sur du papier cristal et c'était lu par un appareil qui servait à lire des comment ça s'appelle cet appareil?
And then you would project it?
Un épiscope.
Peut-être.
Un épiscope.
Le nom, je l'ai pas, c'est pas un nom que je connais, mais ça te dit rien?
Oh, j'étais toute petite, je crois. Quand j'ai fait
Moi,
ça.
je l'ai fait ça à l'école. Et it's completely what you are doing, but how to say that? I think there is a great relation between what you can draw and put on your paper by the Chinese painting technique and what you can put on your film if you have similar work.
Right. And my film work, as we'll see further in the talk, is much closer to drawing, because I think of film frame by frame, and even mark by mark.
Okay.
So instead of, it's not just a way of recording the world. I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in the way marks happen in time, in rapid succession.
It's time.
So you're completely right. And you'll see how true. But here I'm doing watercolor, and this is very influenced, obviously, by the Chinese brushwork that I have become a little better at. And these are a few. This is again watercolor on canvas, and I gessoed the canvas very lightly. It's almost raw, but it really was not a lot like Chinese. It didn't have the absorbency of the rice paper, so it was very different. And then my friends and Katy said, watercolor isn't really the best medium for canvas. You should try acrylic paints because it can work just like watercolors. So I said, okay, I'll try it. And I did. There's a little scrap of canvas I had, and I went, oh, it works. But it's not very much like watercolor either. So then I started, it was hard, but I started painting acrylics on canvas, and it was not very much like watercolor on paper, but it was really interesting and difficult. So I kept going. And again, these are all from the walks in my neighborhood. And that, takes us to these works here. These are just some more that I didn't bring or send. There's a lot of buildings with brick. I love the brick, so I made a lot of brick drawings. And these fences are really challenging to paint. So that takes us to to what's right here. But I'd rather have you look at these than the pictures of them. So back to Bob Huot. Maybe 50 years ago, I think it was 50 years ago, my first knowledge of Bob Huot was when I was in college and one of his films was shown. And I saw a film of his called Spray. And again, this is a period of minimalism and material, film as material, painting as material. And Bob made a film in 1967 called Spray, where he took film with no pictures on it, just clear leader, and spray painted it. And when you project it, it looks something like this. And Bob is a great artist, so and he got many textures. This is not a good video of the film. But when I was looking at this, I was thinking, oh, this is beautiful. But and all these shapes are like grain, you know, the substance, the smallest unit of information of a film image, a photographic image, is the crystals of silver that then get the dye of its color. And this is like that. But what I thought, what if instead of being the unit of a picture, each one was a window through which you could see another picture. And I got, and they weren't all the same one. What if there were many pictures that you could see through simultaneously? It would be like thinking, because when you think, you can be thinking, oh, that's a pretty picture there. I'm hungry. I wonder what I'm doing tomorrow, all at the same time. So I was very naive. I thought I could make a film that would be like that, and it turned out to be more complicated than I expected. But it set me off on the search to try to do something like that. So one of the first things I did was to make a film using a graphic material called Ben-Day dots. There's like, well, you'll see. And to have the images inside that pattern. But I wanted to make it like music. I was very interested in studying music at the time as a form of structuring in time. And so I made a very elaborate score for the piece and devised a way of planning ahead what color and what changes would take place, whether it be slow or fast or stopped. And then this itself becomes a drawing, which I still have. But these are the dots. So inside the dots is one image in the negative, and outside the dots is the positive. And then the dot grows, and the negative becomes the positive. So I'm thinking of color very abstractly. The films that I had been making were already very much about, what are the basic things that make a film, frames, grain, sprockets. And generally we see a film from beginning to end. It goes forward. But I started thinking, well, how arbitrary is that? There are, thousands and thousands of frames. Why should you only see them forward or backwards? Maybe there are many ways we could be thinking about seeing them. So I started making films where I would rearrange the order of the frames in mathematical patterns. And I was at a gas station, a petrol station, and noticed that there was this advertising sign that was turning like this, so you could see, when I was inside, so when it opened, I could see the outside, and then when it closed. But when it was closed, because you were supposed to see it from the outside, from the back, each panel was in the wrong order. Yet the image on each panel was forward, but overall it was backwards. So I made a film that followed that principle. But now looking back, I say, oh, look, I have these layers, and I'm looking through the layers that open and close, and I see that in my painting still. It's somehow I'm attracted to these multiple layers that are both depth and flat. And then also, I have a kind of, Katy says I'm a counter. I always count things. So my work can be very mathematical or very arithmetic. So this is, again, that film of the gas station was all very carefully planned out, and I had a diagram in my mind for how I was going to change it. Oops. This is part of that color series where I was working with just pure color on film. And there again, this one, angular momentum, all the colors in that film are made from exposing the film to 3 different colors of light, red, green, and blue, and changing how much exposure to give for each color. And it's a film that has thousands and thousands of different colors in it, but I had it all planned out. So pages and pages of these numbers that generated the film. So that, you don't really see that in my painting. I no longer do that for this, but once you think that way, there's some relationship there. I was able to make these complex things like the cat film because I was at a school that had equipment, but when I left school and I graduated, all I had was my 16mm camera, and I was still trying to figure out a way of making something that was more like Bob Hewitt's film, where things would swirl around and images would be inside those little spots. So I took film and I punched holes in it and put it in my camera as a loop, and it would become like a mask, and then ran unexposed film and generated something like that. And I thought that was really interesting. It's just a little experiment. And then I discovered that there was this machine called an optical printer that would allow me to rephotograph films frame by frame. So you have a light source, you have something that holds the film, a lens and a camera where you can re-photograph the film frame by frame, and you can even layer the film. So that's how I was able then to continue making these films with different layers. The problem for me with the dots was that I didn't want them to grow. I wanted things to swirl. So I started taking the stickers, these little stickies that you use for offices, little dots, and putting them on paper and arranging them and then animating those. Very crazy, laborious work. And I think there are 3 different layers of images in there. I mean, this is years of work, and it looks very abstract, and it was not exactly doing what I was thinking, but it was interesting.
So it's like animation.
It is animation, but it's animation with live action, all done frame by frame on this optical printer. This is the early mid-70s, before the personal computer was invented. But I met someone who saw what I was doing with the dots on paper, who said, you know, this is what computers do. And he had access to programs that had been developed at Bell Labs, where they let artists work. And so he gave me access to a computer in the basement of a hospital. And I learned to program a couple of programming languages, and I wrote this elaborate program to produce something that resembled what I had been doing by hand. And when I finally got to get it out of the computer and put it on film, Katy made a film of me doing that. So there I am, young, at the computer. Whoops, that's the wrong direction. With a camera set up facing the monitor, which was putting out these grids, and the computer would determine, you know, which squares would be black and which would be white, and then send a signal to the camera to take one picture, and then it would generate the next one. And so I made all of these black and white mats that I then would combine with pictures that were regularly filmed, and produce some films using those computer-generated mats. And again, I'm attracted to landscapes, and again, this is my neighborhood in New York. This is from a film called Works in the Field. But I became dissatisfied with the grid. You know, I felt, you know, I was thinking of it neutrally. You know, I was thinking about the way that it displayed the images inside the squares. But I realized that the grid itself is an image. It's a very overpowering image. And so I wanted to figure out a way that I could work with shapes that themselves would be part of the expressive gestural aspect that I was interested in. And having figured out how this worked through a very rational process, I figured out a way of doing something very similar, but where the shapes could be more biomorphic and more expressive themselves. So again, a landscape film called Chuckswill's Widow. And you see that I'm getting further away from the idea of the grain and you know, the spray paint on film, but you know, what came from that, be interested in, you know, how is it that we perceive images, and you know, finding the boundary between apprehension of representational image and abstraction, something that's flat and something that's deep on the boundary. So, if you'll excuse me, I will take you through a little bit of a lesson about how I make these films. So I beg you to indulge me here a little bit. But often people wonder, you know, how do you actually do that? So this is another film using the same technique that I made later, called Coalfields. And it kind of looks like that when, you know, it's moving. But I start, you know, with a camera and I film a scene. And by now I've developed a lot of sensitivity to what I might get at the end of the process. So I'm no longer filming and photographing the way I would if I were just splicing things together and making, you know, even a film that didn't have a story. But I know that these things are going to layer, and I've become very sensitive to the kinds of motions that work, and the kinds of motions that work against each other in the layers, and the kinds of abstract aspects of an image that will work with the complex imaging of that I'm working with. So I'm looking for things like, you know, I've internalized that kind of seeing. So there's two images, two different, sometimes perspectives of the same scene. Process that. I'll make a drawing to find the shapes that I want to work with. And they're very carefully controlled in terms of the kinds of shapes they are and the amount of area that they take up. I then cut those shapes out of cardboard and put them over a light like that, and then my camera is above and I shoot individual frames. I animate them, moving them around randomly. I combine everything in that machine called the optical printer. And what happens is that those shapes that were black and white, I've developed negative so that they are white on black, so that they become a mask. And when I sandwich them with the picture, only what comes through is in the white area. And every other frame is black. And there's several steps to get here, but this frame and this frame fit together like a puzzle. They don't overlap. And this frame also fit together like a puzzle. They don't overlap. I can barely remember how I did it. So if I sandwich the matte A with the picture A, and then take a picture of that in the optical printer, every other frame in the negative looks like that. And I wind the film back to the beginning very precisely. Oops. So if I develop it at that point, you just see this. Then the B matte with the B picture, I put image on the in-between frames. And it's got to be exact or it's all messed up. So you take, that's what you see for the first one, that's what you see for the second one, and together it looks like that. But actually, they're on separate frames, and you only see them together because they're very rapidly projected one after the other in the motion of the film. So you saw that with Chuck's Widow. I'm not going to show you Coalfields. 20 years later, I mean, Coalfields was I kind of had achieved what I was after for those 10 or 15 years where I was doing all that experimenting. And so I dropped that and I went on to other things. But when computers started taking, when video and film and photography started to merge, I started saying, that was very difficult what I did on analog film back in the 70s and 80s. I wonder if I could do that on a computer. It would be an awful lot easier. And for many years, the computers weren't fast enough. They couldn't do it. But eventually, they became fast enough. And that's where I started these experiments. And I named these little experiments that I made ornithologies, both in reference to the family birds, but also in reference to the music of jazz and Charlie Parker, who was called The Bird, and whose record was called Ornithology. So, Ornithology 1, and I mostly haven't shown these. These are just things for myself. But I was playing with different shapes. And these are all drawn straight with the mouse in the computer.
And the film is film that you digitized?
And that was video.
Oh, it was video.
But already here, I was going on, there's a period in my life it was very hard to find the time to make art because of jobs and family, and I mean, I don't need to tell any of you about that. So I started this series where I would go to a neighborhood. I might invite a friend to go with me, and I would take a walk in a neighborhood and explore New York. I went to all different neighborhoods, and I just shoot stuff that attracted to me, and that's where many of these images came from. And again, these are all drawn in the computer, and you can have so much control in the computer. So I could make the space between the shapes any thickness that I wanted. So I had all these different parameters that I could control. And I wondered, why am I doing this? I thought I was done with this 20 years ago. There must be some reason that I'm doing this other than that I can. I'm still asking that question. So I had already done these when I made the discovery about painting on the paper, and I thought, oh, this would be, I can bring the drawing, the analog, back into this video work in the computer, and that'll tie that work together. Maybe I begin to answer the question of why am I doing this? So that, Ornithology 6 is the one that's on display here. Where I use that as a source. And instead of using the optical printer now, I can combine everything in the computer. So if you're familiar with these programs, Premiere or Avid or After Effects or now DaVinci Resolve, they have the capability of doing that. So that's the technical part. Not necessarily the most interesting aspect, but maybe useful for ask you the bigger questions of why and what. It's down here, I think. That's it.
Thank you.
So I'll be very happy to respond to any questions or observations or just chat.
I thought